is Saurabh, and you're listening to my favorite talk show, The Weekly Show with Aditya.
This is episode 231 on the 8th of July 2020. Tonight's episode is divided into three parts. If you have gone through the email I sent earlier, the agenda, then you would know what those three parts are. But I am going to reiterate once again. Part 1 will be singing of a new song. With the success of the previous episode and the accolades received for adding the song feature to this talk show, this juggernaut will continue. Part 2 will be, as usual, reading from the book PG Wodehouse Aunt's Omnibus. Part 3 is further subdivided into two parts. Part A of Part 3 is discussing the Extreme Rules pay-per-view WWE event, which will be broadcast live on 20th July at 4 a.m. Indian Standard Time. That's the second part of Part 3 will be discussing the restarting of cricket under Extreme Rules and how sportsperson, stakeholders, active and passive, will adopt and adapt to the new normal, or will it be a new gimmick? Stay tuned to this episode and India's #1 host will discuss all this. Let's start with the song. तेरी ऊंची शान है मौला, मेरी अर्जी मान ले मौला, तू है सब कुछ जानने वाला, मैं हूँ तेरा मानने वाला, मुझको भी तो लिफ्ट करा दे, थोड़ी सी तो लिफ्ट करा दे। तेरी ऊंची शान है मौला, मेरी मर्जी मान ले मौला, तू है सब कुछ जानने वाला, मैं हूँ तेरा मानने वाला, बंगला मोटर कार दिला दे, एक नहीं तो चार दिला दे, मुझको एरोप्लेन दिला दे, दुनिया भर की सैर करा दे, कैसे कैसों को दिया है, ऐसे वैसों को दिया है, मुझको भी तो लिफ्ट करा दे, थोड़ी सी तो लिफ्ट करा दे। डॉलर दे या पाउंड दे दे, डॉलर दे या पाउंड दे दे, कैश दे दे, चेक बना दे, दिरहम ओ दीनार दे दे, डॉलर दे या पाउंड दे दे, डॉलर दे या पाउंड दे दे, कैश दे दे, चेक बना दे, फिर ओ दीनार दे दे। कोई छप्पड़ फाड़ मौला, अपनी जेबे जाड़ मौला, अब तो मुझको माल दे दे, और न अब ढाल दे दे, मुझको भी तो लिफ्ट करा दे, थोड़ी सी तो लिफ्ट करा दे, बंगला मोटर कार दिला दे, एक नहीं तो चार दिला दे, कैसे कैसों को दिया है, ऐसे वैसों को दिया है, मुझको भी तो लिफ्ट करा दे, थोड़ी सी तो लिफ्ट करा दे। सोना दे या चांदी दे दे, सोना दे या चांदी दे दे, हीरे दे दे, मोती दे दे, नोटों की बरसात कर दे, सोना दे या चांदी दे दे, सोना दे या चांदी दे दे, हीरे दे दे, मोती दे दे, नोटों की बरसात कर दे। तूने ही खुद तो कहा है, देता हूँ जो मांगता है, कब से बंदा मांग रहा है, कब से लाइन में खड़ा है, मुझको भी तो लिफ्ट करा दे, थोड़ी सी तो लिफ्ट करा दे, मुझको एरोप्लेन दिला दे, दुनिया भर की सैर करा दे, कैसे कैसों को दिया है, ऐसे वैसों को दिया है, मुझको भी तो लिफ्ट करा दे, थोड़ी सी तो लिफ्ट करा दे। मेरी ऊंची शान है मौला, मेरी अर्जी मान ले मौला, तू है सब कुछ जानने वाला, मैं हूँ तेरा मानने वाला, मुझको भी तो लिफ्ट करा दे, थोड़ी सी तो लिफ्ट करा दे, बंगला मोटर कार दिला दे, एक नहीं तो चार दिला दे, दुनिया भर की सैर करा दे। This ends part 1 of this episode. Stay tuned for part 2. Time to continue reading from the chapter of the book PG Wodehouse Aunt's Omnibus. Our protagonist Bertram Wooster is with his dad, who has been asking about Tortola Towers and the residents of this place. He has been giving a rather accurate account of what he feels about the inhabitants, or as he calls the inmates of this place, and how eccentric these people are and how his dad wants to meet them, or has already met a couple of them, as in Gussie Fink Nortel, who is engaged to Madeline Bassett. It wasn't that I had any objection to the sainted Pinker. I loved him like a bee. We were up at Oxford together, and our relations have always been on strictly David and Jonathan lines. But while technically not a resident of Tortola Towers, he helped the vicar wet the souls of local yokels in the adjoining village of Tortola in the Wold, and that was near enough to make this sudden popping up of his deepen the apprehension I was feeling. It seemed to me that it not only needed Sir Watkin Bassett, Madeline Bassett, Roderick Spoot, and the dog Bartholomew to saunter in arm, and I would have a full hand. My respect for my guardian angel's astuteness hit a new high. A gloomy bird with a marked disposition to take the dark view and make one's flesh creep. But there was no gainsaying that he knew the stuff. Bung him in, I said dully, and in due season the Reverend H.P. Pinker lumbered across the threshold and, advancing with outstretched hand, tripped over his feet and upset a small table. His almost invariable practice when moving from spot to spot in any room where there's furniture. Which was odd when you come to think of it, because after representing his university for 4 years and his country for 6 on the football field, he still turns out for the Harlequins when he can get a Saturday off from saving souls, and when footballing is as steady on his pins as a hart or a roe or whatever the animals are there don't trip over their feet and upset things. I have seen him a couple of times in the arena and was profoundly impressed by his virtuosity. Rugby football is more or less a sealed book to me, I never having gone in for it, but even I could see that he was good. The lisssomeness with which he moved hither and thither was almost impressive, as was his homicidal ardor when doing what I believe is called tackling. Like the Canadian Mounted Police, he always got his man, and when he did so, the air was vibrant with excited cries of morticians in the audience making bids for the body. He is engaged to be married to Stiffy Bing, and his long years of football should prove an excellent preparation for setting up house with her. The way I look at it is that when a fellow has plugged uglies in cleated boots, doing a shuffle off to Buffalo on his face, Saturday after Saturday since he was a slip of a boy, he must get to fear nothing, not even marriage, with a girl like Stiffy, who from early childhood has seldom let the sun go down without starting some loony enterprise calculated to bleach the hair of one and all. There was plenty and to spare of the Reverend H.P. Pinker. Even as a boy, I imagine he must have burst seams and broken try your weight machines, and grown to man's estate. He might have been Roderick Spoot's twin brother. Purely in the matter of thews, sinews, and tunage, I mean, of course, For whereas Roderick's Spood went about seeking whom he might devour and was a constant menace to pedestrians and traffic, Stinker, though no doubt a fiend in human shape when assisting the Harlequins Rugby Football Club to dismember some rival troop of athletes, was in private life a gentle soul with whom a child could have played. In fact, I once saw a child doing so. Usually, when you meet this man of God, you find him beaming. I believe his merry smile is one of the sides of Totally in the world, as it was of Magdalene College, Oxford, when we were up there together. But now I seem to note in his aspect a certain gravity, as if he had just discovered schism in his flock or found a couple of choir boys smoking reefers in the churchyard. He gave me the impression of a 200-pound curate with something on his mind beside his hair. Upsetting another table, he took a seat and said he was glad he had caught me. I thought I'll find you at the drones. You have, I assured him. What brings you to the Metrop? I came up for a Harlequins committee meeting. And how were they all? Oh, fine. That's good. I have been worrying myself sick about the Harlequins committee. Well, how have you been keeping, Stinker? I have been all right. Are you free for dinner? Sorry, I've got to get back to Totally. Too bad. Jeeves tells me Sir Watkin and Madeline and Steffi have been staying with my aunt at Brinkley. Yes, have they returned? Yes. And how's Steffi? Oh, fine. And Bartholomew? Oh, fine. And your parishioners going strong, I trust? Oh, yes, they are fine. I wonder if anything strikes you about the slice of give and take I have just recorded? No? Oh, surely. I mean, here we are, Stinker, Pinker and Bertram Wooster, buddies who had known each other virtually from the egg, and we were talking like a couple of strangers making conversation on a train. At least he was, and more I became convinced that his bosom was full of the perilous stuff that weighs upon the heart, as I remember Jeeves putting it once. I persevered in my efforts to uncork him. Well, Stinker, I said, what's new? Has Pop Bassett given you that vicage yet? This caused him to open up a bit. His manner became more animated. No, not yet. He doesn't seem able to make up his mind. One day he says he will. The next day he says he's not so sure. He'll have to think it over. I frowned. I disapproved of this shilly-shallying. I could see how it must be throwing a spanner into Stinker's whole foreign policy, putting him in a spot and causing him alarm and despondency. He can't marry Stiffy on a curate's stipend, so they have got to wait till Pop Bassett gives him a vicard which he has in his gift. And while I personally, though fond of the young Gumboil, would run a mile in tight shoes to avoid marrying Stiffy, I knew him enough to be strongly in favor of signing her up. This ends part 2 of this episode, the reading session. Stay tuned for part 3. Welcome to part 3 of this episode. WWE continues to dish out its monthly pay-per-views, from WrestleMania since the pandemic and the lockdown struck, to Money in the Bank and Backlash, comes another pay-per-view called Extreme Rules, the Horror Show. While the title is for the WWE pay-per-view, this title is aptly named for what is going to happen when the England-West Indies Test Series restarts cricket after a gap of nearly 20 weeks. While the domestic version of sports has started, F1 has started. When I mean the domestic version, I mean the various domestic football leagues, the Serie A, the English Premier League, the UEFA League. Though it's ironical that while they are comfortable restarting the league with all their biosecurity rules, they were not comfortable starting the Euro 2020, which I find to be absolutely double standard and nothing more than a gimmick if they are concerned about players' safety and all that surrounds this situation. But let's talk about WWE's Extreme Rules pay-per-view first. As you know, it's going to be a championship pay-per-view, means every championship will be defended. Just like the previous pay-per-view events, and because of the situation where they cannot host in a bigger arena, they are continuing to host this action inside their performance training center in Orlando, Florida. First, let's look at some of the non-title matches that will take place. The furious rivalry that has been a part of WWE. When we talk about rivalries in WWE, we talk about Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels, which was something of the 1980s and the 1990s. Then it's the one between Triple H and Rock, which was a major part of mid-90s, late 90s and early 2000s. Then of course the famous rivalry between Shawn Michaels and Undertaker with most of his opponents. Of late, such rivalries have not been put in the classic box. Means in the contemporary times, there are not too many rivalries which we are putting as the top rivalries of this particular sport. Though the WWE management has tried to revive a rivalry, it was not exactly a rivalry, it was more of a friendship turned bitter rivals. As you knew, Randy Orton and Edge met twice. They met at WrestleMania in a no holds barred match, no disqualifications, no countouts, in a last man standing match, which then went to Backlash when these two fought in the greatest wrestling match ever, as WWE tried to revive these old superstars. By old, I mean semi-retired and retired, to get them back in the ring so that they could get maximum viewers. While Edge continues to be on the sidelines after an injury during his greatest wrestling match, Randy Orton has now picked up a new rivalry with Big Show. It's not direct rivalry, it never happens, but there is a possibility of a match between Randy Orton and Big Show, two wrestlers who dominated a major part of the mid-90s and the early 2000s. So the first non-title match that is proposed is between Braun Strowman and Bray Wyatt. If you remember, Braun Strowman was challenged by Bray Wyatt for a Universal Championship match at the Money in the Bank pay-per-view. And since the Money in the Bank pay-per-view match and post WrestleMania, Bray Wyatt has been enticing Braun Strowman to come back into the old fold, to be a part of what was called the Wyatt family. If we remember, I had talked extensively about this. Strowman meets Wyatt in a non-title swamp match. This is a case of partners turned rival turned nemesis. Strowman has challenged Wyatt by offering up a unique challenge to his nemesis, and the Wyatt Swamp fight was made official. So it's a swamp fight match. Another addition to the WWE's attempt to have cinematic matches. This match is not going to be contested for the Universal title. Let's move further. Another rivalry in which one individual has had a hold over the other is the one between Sheamus and Jeff Hardy. Jeff Hardy, who returned to this sport after a brief gap, and all the personal issues and everything that was made a part of his redemption story. Sheamus, Jeff Hardy continue to tease each other, one having an advantage over the other every time this happens. It's a possibility that this match might take place, but this rivalry has heated so much and the previous matches have been on a tie. The management is obviously trying to make the Hardy Sheamus match, if it is scheduled, as epic as the Orton Edge match, which will be a very interesting stipulation because the Orton Edge craze which people have, will it be contested by the likes of Hardy and Sheamus, who are popular but not as crazy popular as Orton and Edge? Now let's look at some of the title matches which will take place. First is the WWE World Championship, that is between Drew McIntyre, who has so far since winning at WrestleMania been holding on to his title. He has defeated the likes of Bobby Lashley and Seth Rollins, but now he has another rival, more like partner turned rival. Dolph Ziggler was a part of the story when McIntyre returned. McIntyre was more like his muscle when Dolph Ziggler was attempting to win back his Intercontinental Championship 2 years ago. But after the brand extension and these two going into separate brands, and now Dolph Ziggler returning back to Raw after being traded with AJ Styles. Not the first time two partners have turned rival. It has happened before. We have seen this with Bray Wyatt and Braun Strowman. We have seen this with Orton and Edge. We have seen this with other individuals, and now this is the one between McIntyre and Ziggler. Before that, it was between Bobby Lashley and McIntyre. So I am curious to see as to how this match will pan out. If you ask me, McIntyre has the muscle and the strength to tackle any mind games by Ziggler, but Ziggler must be having something up his sleeve. And what could be the stipulation? According to me, it could be a no disqualification match, which means falls counts anywhere, or use of the steel chair, the table, anything can happen. It's Extreme Rules, it's the horror show, the way they have given the nomenclature to this particular pay-per-view. And of course, there are the women's championships. The Raw Women's Championship with Women's Tag Team Champion Sasha Banks challenging Asuka for the Raw Women's Championship so that she, like her partner Bayley, can be two belts. Now it will be very interesting as to whether this happens or not. Will Banks win the championship or will Bayley lose the championship? Before they challenge Asuka for the Raw Women's Championship, Banks and Bayley have to defend their Women's Tag Team Championship against in a Raw episode next week against Asuka and Kairi Sane. So it will be a very interesting duel. If Asuka and Kairi Sane manage to win the Women's Tag Team Championship and Asuka doesn't lose her title, and if Bayley doesn't lose her title as well, will they go to the extent that they will let Kairi Sane challenge Bayley for the SmackDown Women's Championship? It's going to be a very interesting story. As I said, there was something of a craze in the mid 90s, the late 90s, the early 2000s. There was something there where even the most mundane of matches were becoming the greatest matches ever, were transforming into rivalries. But now we are not seeing that, partly because of the situation surrounding the what has been happening over the past 3 to 4 months, and partly how an individual with a limited mind sees 2000 and 2020 with all the pseudo media coming into effect. That's a discussion for another day. Another non-title rivalry which has heated up over the past couple of months is the one between Rey Mysterio and Seth Rollins. As I said before, Seth Rollins' persona has developed into a new one. What is that? That is not to be revealed right now. As I said, in WWE, anything can happen. If you have a respect for a fellow wrestler, it may not come out explicitly. It may come out in a way which we may find absolutely repulsive. That is the way they may try to show their respect for the other wrestler. But then that's how the entire idea of WWE is developed. So these were some of the title and the non-title matches. There would be more. So I will be coming back next week to talk about this and eventually talking about the results of the match and how did this particular pay-per-view take place. But let's get back to something more interesting, something which everybody is looking forward to. Let's say 20% of the world is looking forward to. Sport of cricket, which had been shut down for the last 147 days, nearly 21 and a half weeks, will resume with the match between England and West Indies. And it's now in a cocoon, in a bio bubble. What one calls the biosecurity, the new normal, means no hugging between the cricketers, no handshakes, staying apart, staying far off, no high fives, no saliva on the ball, no venturing out after the match is over. You will have to be confined to your on-site hotel. What's the bubble? The dictionary defines biosecurity as the precautions taken to protect against the spread of lethal or harmful organisms and diseases. And with all this, I'm still disappointed that sports matches have not yet resumed in India. Should they resume? Yes. Can they follow all the precautions? Why not? Take a gamble, resume and try and follow all the precautions. I see no harm in restarting sports matches in India. Whether it's a combat sport, it's a touch sport, whether it's wrestling, boxing, martial arts, running, any sport. Should they start? Yes. We keep saying sports is not important. Well, let me remind this group, sports person also need to earn a living. Unless you are giving them a backup job. Well, what is the backup job for most sports person after retirement? They become coaches or they become administrators or commentators. Right now, none of these three venues are open. If matches are not happening, then commentators are not in play. Coaches are also not going to be doing what they are supposed to do. Administrators are also not going to do much since sports matches cannot be resumed. Saying that sports is not important, maybe not from the point of view of entertainment, but from the point of view of livelihood, yes, it should restart. Let's continue this definition of biosecurity. The idea is to shortlist a few venues that will have all the facilities on site: ground, practice arena, gym, and hotel, at a time when travel restrictions are in place and a 14-day quarantine is a must. Cricket administrators believe such facilities will be perfect for teams. So why don't we follow this? Why don't all sporting venues all over the world do this, that sports person don't have to move out? This is a complete coincidence that in England a couple of the sporting venues, the cricket grounds, have all these facilities on site, the hotel, the practice arena, the gym, that they don't have to move out. And once they finish their training period, they go into their rooms and shut themselves in. That is what is a cocoon, isn't it? The idea is that players and officials will stay at these on site facilities throughout and be tested regularly for the virus. The interesting premise is that normally the International Cricket Council doesn't interfere in a match except when it's the situation of match fixing or a player has used some abusive language at another player or their conduct is unbecoming of the sport. But now the interference that the International Cricket Council will have will be larger than what they usually do. What constitutes an ideal biosecure sporting environment? According to the England Cricket Board, the grounds would be divided into designated zones that would separate the teams, match officials, ground staff, and media. And people from each sector will have to confine themselves to their respective bubbles. Since the players can't interact with the broadcasters, the commentators, they will be in a different section. They will have their own conversations. The players, if they want to have a conversation, will need to have more like a remote video conferencing interviews, or maybe those interviews will not take place. There will be no post-match interviews and there will be no post-end of series awards. Maybe the awards will be sent to the players wrapped in a secure package, but there will be no photo ops. That is the idea I'm getting from this new normal, or as I like to call it, a new gimmick. Imagine the match scenario like this. Jofra Archer is steaming in at 150 kilometers per hour and bowling to the future of West Indies, Shai Hope. He comes, Hope gets bowled inside edge. What does Archer do? He goes back to his run up. He says hello to his teammates by waving. The teammates punch in the air, but they don't come close to the bowler. They just celebrate by giving those virtual and imaginative high fives. Or I don't think they are going to go in the direction of football, where I saw a couple of matches where they were doing the elbow fist and coming together. In football, you cannot avoid that. In cricket, you are eventually so far away from each other. Somebody is at mid on, somebody is at long on. They are 100 meters away from each other, that it won't make a difference. But the question will be, will there even be a spinner allowed to bowl? Yes, the England team and the West Indies team have a spinner. The proximity between the keeper and the batter, how will that work out? Will there be slips? Will there be those short legs and gullies and all that? I'm curious. But in countries like England and Australia, since the ball doesn't spin as it does in so-called the subcontinent, they may not require a short leg, a gully, a silly point, because the ball doesn't go there. Imagine no slips, outside edge, ball goes away for 4. The batsman plays it where there could have been a silly point or a short leg, the ball falls in the gap. Why? Because the players are afraid to catch it. And then, if you know, a couple of months ago, before all this scenario started, we used to lament that people are not coming to watch a certain category of the section of test matches, especially in India. In England and Australia, there used to be full houses, but in India, no, and now people won't come. So how will the revenue model work? Will the broadcasters, the sponsors be interested? No gate money will be coming in. But for now, I don't think people are even talking about the revenue part of this. They are more about, can we have a match successfully for 5 days without anybody falling ill or any untoward incident happening. Because now everything is a punishment. Players hugging is a punishment, players coming close together is a punishment, any interaction with an official who is not part of the zone is punishment, as if you don't know whether that zone exists, whether those people exist. And while we wrap our heads around and try to make sure that a sport starts with all the precautions possible, for me, what they call the new normal, I call the new gimmick. Will I watch the match? Well, I'm curious to see as to how players are able to control their inner desire to not go and hug someone, to not high five, to not talk. And now, before I end, another interesting thing. Joe Root is not available for personal reasons. So Ben Stokes, the top all-rounder, takes charge in his first ever test match. Now, if you remember, England has had only 3 great all-rounders. But for me, Ian Botham is not number 1. Andrew Flintoff was average. He is an okay player. But from what I have seen of Ben Stokes, the things Ben Stokes has done, irrespective of the fact that whether it's in the gimmick-induced modern-day world or the semi-modern-day world of Flintoff or of the medieval world of Ian Botham, looking at all these 3, and irrespective of how cricket has grown in terms of technology and other places, for me, Ben Stokes would have been a better player had he been a contemporary of Ian Botham. So when we talk about England's all-rounders, I would name Ben Stokes as number 1, not because of the emotions associated, but because what I have seen of Ben Stokes in the last decade, while Botham and Flintoff were more of an average kind of players. Why don't we change in this aspect the way bowlers bowl? Why don't we have a baseball induced bowler? When he doesn't run in, he just picks the ball and throws at the batter, like we do in baseball. The pitcher, they just take the glove, they move in one direction and they throw the ball. This way they won't get tired, there won't be any suspicions of things arriving or they are unwell or something, and they will keep their energy stored. As and when the match starts, I will talk about this. It won't be about what is happening in the match, it will be about how players behave, staying away, no hugging, no high fives, no conversations with the umpire about the ball, the umpire staying away from the players, he doesn't take their caps, sweaters. Players will have to be very careful about the bottles they drink from. All these things are the things I'm looking forward to as to how will this happen. And this is what the most of the commentators will be discussing. This is not about the match, this is about everything that surrounds it, literally in a bubble. This ends episode number 231 on the 8th of July 2020. Stay tuned for the next episode.
For more awesome content, tune in to the next episode of the weekly show with Aditya.